Forget what you think you know about sex in the Middle Ages. Forget the stories told by movies, the feasting nobles pulling maidens onto furs, the sweaty peasants in barns, the orgiastic excess of brothels in plague-ridden cities. Forget it all just for a moment. That world did exist, in parts, but it was not the whole story. The truth, as always, is quieter and much more human. Because the truth is, most people in the medieval world didn't think of sex the way we do today. They didn't talk about it. They didn't advertise it. They didn't decorate their language or their bodies with it. In fact, for the majority, sex wasn't even something to seek for pleasure. It was something that simply happened, often quietly, often in the dark, often with more obligation than desire. Imagine, for a moment, a woman named Elsbet. She lives in a small village in what is now southern Germany. Her world is made of wool and wood, of chickens and cold rain, of spinning wheels and smoke-blackened ceilings. She is 22, already married, already a mother. When she lays beside her husband at night, she doesn't think of love poems or pleasure. She thinks of the leaking roof, the aching in her knees, the last time she bled. For someone like Elsbet, sex was woven into survival. A duty, a rhythm, a means of maintaining a place in a community. It was not shameful, but neither was it exalted. It was simply part of life. And yet, inside the silence, there was feeling. There were moments, sometimes brief, sometimes unspoken, when hands met in kindness, when the burden of the day lifted just enough for something else to surface. Not lust, maybe, but warmth, recognition, a small ember of humanity in the cold night. It's important to understand that the Middle Ages, a period spanning roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century, were not one single experience. They contained cathedrals and cow pastures, queens and midwives, parchment and pig pens. And within all of this, sex took on many forms, but it was shaped, always, by three great forces: the church, the body, and the silence. Let's begin with the body. The medieval body was not the body we know today. It was not waxed or perfumed or analyzed in textbooks. It was earthy, strong, weathered. People smelled of sweat and soil. Bathing was occasional. A woman might only wash her hair every few weeks. A man might wear the same tunic until it stiffened with oil. And yet these bodies still touched, still ached, still wanted. But desire did not come freely. It was often stifled, tangled in shame and rules. Girls were taught to be modest. Boys were taught to be strong, and both were taught that the flesh was dangerous, a vessel of temptation that must be mastered, not indulged. The Church, especially from the 12th century onward, became the gatekeeper of sex. And what a heavy gate it was. It told people when they could have sex, only within marriage, why they could have sex, only to make children, and how they could have sex, only in certain positions, and only with the correct intentions. Anything outside that, from masturbation to same-sex relations, from adultery to even expressing too much pleasure, was sin. Mortal sin, in fact, the kind that might send your soul to eternal torment. But people are people, and they don't always listen. There are court records, letters, confessions, poems, even sermons, all whispering the truth, that even in the most devout villages, under the strictest eyes, desire found a way, sometimes in alleyways, sometimes in fields, sometimes in stolen glances between merchant and maid, monk and traveler, widow and farm boy. And sometimes it happened with no romance at all, only routine, only the expectation that a wife would serve her husband, that a husband would do his duty, that bodies would meet like oxen yoked for plowing. not cruelly, but also not tenderly. The language of love, as we know it, was rare, but it did exist. In poetry, mostly, among the nobility. The courts of love, the chansons, the sighs of ladies-in-waiting dreaming of knights who wrote verses by candlelight. But even then, the reality was often colder. Marriages were made for land, for alliances, for power. And once the vows were spoken, love became a secondary matter. Still, there were moments. Moments when a young wife might linger at her husband's side after the harvest, when a husband might pull a shawl over his sleeping wife's shoulders before dawn, when, despite everything, despite the weight of religion and mud and expectation, a kiss might land gently on a weathered cheek. And stay. That is where we begin, not with scandal, not with fire, but with something quieter, something real. Imagine a world without mirrors. Not entirely. Polished metal did exist, and sometimes glass, but for most people, the reflection they saw was warped, brief, or second-hand. A surface in water. A comment from a neighbor. The fingers of a lover tracing a line down their spine. In the Middle Ages, you did not grow up with an image of your own body. You knew your hands from work, your feet from pain, your mouth from prayers. But your face, your form, these were mysteries. And in that absence, people came to know themselves through others, through words, through touch, through judgment. Let us linger in that. The body was not an object to sculpt or expose. It was a vessel, created by God, destined for toil. Its curves were not admired but managed. Its scents were not masked but endured. A young girl in a village might never see another naked body until her wedding night. A boy might not know the shape of his own back, his own thighs, until they pressed against another. The body was hidden, not only by fabric, but by silence. Clothing, too, was not about expression. It was about function, layer upon layer, from linen to wool to leather. A woman might wear a shift, a kirtle, a gown, a veil. A man, hose and tunic and coif. These layers created distance. Disrobing was not swift, not cinematic. It was slow, awkward, sometimes even reluctant. In that slow unwrapping, anticipation was replaced by practicality. There were no corsets to untie dramatically, no lace to peel away, just fabric stiff with use, buttons made of bone, knots tied with weathered fingers. But that didn't mean the body wasn't known. It was known in sickness, in childbirth, in injury. A mother would wash her children's wounds. A midwife would touch more skin than a lover. And within the tight bounds of villages and homes, people saw more than we might expect. Not as voyeurism, but as necessity. Bathing was often communal when it occurred. A wooden tub by the fire, filled and emptied by hand. Whole families might use the same water, one after the other, steam rising from bare shoulders, modesty held only by habit and shadow. And yet, despite the grime, despite the rules, the body still held beauty. Consider the hands. Calloused, yes, but strong. A shepherd's hands, sun-browned and gentle. A weaver's hands, swift and sure. A woman's hands, worn from dough and diapers and prayer. These were hands that knew their purpose, and knew, too, the comfort of another's skin. Or consider the hair, uncut for years, braided, oiled, perfumed with rosemary. A wife might run a comb through her husband's beard. A girl might sit for hours while her grandmother plaited her hair by candlelight. These gestures were quiet, but intimate. They said, "I see you. I care for what is yours." And then there were the eyes. In a world without photographs, the eyes were everything. They captured memory. They lingered too long. They looked away too fast. A glance across a market stall, a stolen look at a feast, a flicker during Mass. Eyes spoke what lips could not. And when sex was veiled in sin, it was the eyes that betrayed the truth. But not every body was accepted. The Church taught that deformity was a punishment. That difference was danger. A hunched back, a withered limb, a birthmark. These could mark someone as cursed or worse. And yet many such people lived full lives. Married, loved. Their stories survive not in books, but in bones, in burial records, in whispers. It's also worth noting, medieval people were smaller than we are today. Malnutrition, disease, hard labor all played a role. The average man stood around 5'6", 160 centimeters, the average woman even shorter. Teeth were often lost early. Scars were common. And yet these were the bodies people lived in, worked in, touched in the dark. They were not perfect, but they were known. And then there was nakedness. Not the nakedness of statues or paintings, but the real thing. It was rare and it was loaded. To be naked was to be vulnerable. It happened during birth, during death, during punishment. Public shaming often involved stripping someone bare, exposing them not only to cold but to judgment. And yet, between lovers, that same vulnerability could become something else. Trust. Imagine a man seeing his wife naked for the first time, on their wedding night. She stands by the hearth, her shift drawn up. The firelight catches the curve of her shoulder, the pale of her thigh. He is not aroused, not yet. He is overwhelmed. This is sacred. This is forbidden. This is terrifying. Or imagine a widow, years later, undressing herself in solitude, touching the lines time left behind, remembering hands that once knew her. These are the bodies they inhabited, flawed, fragrant, finite, and through them they reached for one another, sometimes with tenderness, sometimes with duty, but always with the quiet knowledge that in a world of toil and silence, the body was one of the only places where something wordless could still be spoken. To understand intimacy in the Middle Ages, we must first understand who was allowed to love and how. Because in that world, love was not free. It was measured, guided, bound in parchment and ritual, and above all, it was ruled by the Church. For the medieval Christian, which most people in Europe were by the 12th century, sex was not a personal act. It was a spiritual one, a dangerous one, a necessary one, and one that could tip the balance of your eternal soul. You see, for the Church, sex was both holy and hazardous. Holy when done in marriage, with the purpose of creating life. Hazardous when done for pleasure, or outside the bounds of wedlock, or in any way that hinted at indulgence. The body was weak, the flesh sinful, and desire itself was seen as something inherited from the fall, a crack in human nature that needed constant control. From the pulpit, priests warned of lust with fire in their voices. Monks copied treatises condemning every possible form of unnatural acts. Confessors asked probing questions, and theologians debated, in long, meticulous Latin, what exactly was permitted and what wasn't. Marriage, then, became a kind of gate. It was the one place where sex was allowed, barely, and even there it came with rules. So many rules. Let's walk through them. First, you had to marry correctly. That meant not within your own bloodline, and the Church was very particular about what bloodline meant, sometimes extending to seventh cousins. You also couldn't marry someone already promised to another, or someone who had taken religious vows, or someone too young. Age, of course, was a sliding scale. The Church technically allowed girls to marry at 12, boys at 14. But in practice, many couples waited, not for love, but for land, dowries, arrangements. A noble daughter might be promised at birth. A peasant girl might wed once she could manage a household. Once married, a couple was expected to be faithful and fertile. Sex, in this context, was a duty. Theologians used the Latin term debitum coniugale, the marital debt. That meant a spouse was obligated to satisfy the other's sexual needs, not to please them, not to delight them, but to fulfill the contract. A man could demand sex from his wife, and she could not refuse, unless he was asking on a holy day or during her menstrual cycle, or while she was pregnant, or in times of mourning. But here's the twist. She could also demand it from him, and if he refused too often, she could, in some places, go to court. Yes, in a world ruled by male power and clerical silence, a woman could sue her husband for neglecting the bed. Because even the church understood, without sex there could be no children, and without children there could be no future. Still, pleasure was another matter. Pleasure was dangerous. There was a deep suspicion of joy in sex, especially if it showed. Groaning, writhing, moaning, these could be seen as signs of sin. In confession, people were asked whether they had enjoyed it too much, whether they had imagined someone else, whether they had done it in the natural way. That last part became a fixation. You see, medieval theologians were obsessed with position. Only one was truly acceptable, the so-called missionary position. Man on top, woman beneath, face to face, ideally in silence, ideally thinking of God. Any deviation, from behind, standing, even side by side, could be labeled sinful. And if you think this sounds severe, it was. But people didn't always obey. There are records of confessions that suggest far more variety and far more curiosity than the sermons would like to admit. A woman in England in the 13th century admitted to tying up her husband. A man in France was accused of sleeping with his maid while his wife watched. There were even clergy, monks, and priests who broke their vows and wrote about it, sometimes with sorrow, sometimes without. Behind closed doors, human beings were still human, but guilt followed them, not just from the church, but from the culture itself. Stories circulated of women who died in childbirth as punishment for past indiscretions, of men struck with illness after sleeping with whores, of demons visiting couples who enjoyed themselves too much. Whether true or not, these stories lingered like smoke in the rafters. Yet, amid all this, love still found space. There are letters, so many letters, from knights to their ladies, from wives to husbands off at war. Tender words, longing, grief, sometimes coded, sometimes plain. One man in 1420 wrote to his betrothed, "I kiss your name in my sleep and wake tasting salt." Another, a woman widowed too young, wrote, "The sheets remember you longer than I dare to." And in folk songs, especially among peasants, love was often bawdy, mischievous, warm. A shepherd teasing a milkmaid, a girl singing about her apron strings coming undone, a man boasting of a night he'd never forget. These were not church songs, but they were honest. They reminded everyone that sex wasn't just about rules. It was about life, about heat in the cold, about breath shared, about presence. Even in marriage, even with all the rules, something could still slip through. A smile, a sigh, a hand held longer than needed. That was the real secret. The church might have written the rules, but people wrote their own stories. In bed, in barns, in hearts. The wedding night. It sounds romantic, doesn't it? The culmination of longing. The soft, close to a day of celebration. two people finally alone, finally allowed. But in the Middle Ages it was rarely that simple, because before the wedding night came everything else: the preparation, the pressure, the fear. And for many it was not a night of pleasure, but of duty, mystery, or even dread. Let's start with the courtship. For peasants, love often began in the fields. A boy and a girl working side by side during harvest, teasing over baskets of grain, brushing hands while carrying firewood. Their love grew through shared labor, shared hardships. There were few letters, fewer gifts, maybe a ribbon, maybe a song, but mostly glances, smiles, promises made while feeding animals or fetching water. For nobles, it was far more complicated. Marriages were arranged, not by hearts, but by lands and bloodlines. A young woman might be promised to a man she'd met only once, or never. Negotiations would happen between fathers, uncles, sometimes kings. A bride's value was measured in dowries and alliances, not in dreams. She might be 12, he might be 35, and no one would ask what she wanted. Still, even within those cold contracts, warmth sometimes emerged. There are records of noble women who grew to love their husbands, of arranged matches that turned tender, of men who learned to listen, of women who found strength in their roles. Love, when it came later, slowly, like ivy growing over stone. Then came the rituals. The wedding itself was less about romance and more about legitimacy. In the Church's eyes, a marriage was valid as long as both parties agreed, verbally, publicly, and in the present tense. I take you. That was it. But local customs layered on their own traditions: rings, feasts, blessings. Sometimes the couple would hold hands over a sword. Sometimes they'd share a cup of mead. But the real proof of marriage came later: the consummation. And here the expectations were immense. A bride was expected to be a virgin. This was not just about morality, it was about property. Virginity was proof of value, of purity, of untouched lineage. Entire reputations rested on whether a bedsheet came back bloodied the next morning. There were even witnesses in some cases: servants, midwives, family members who waited outside the door, listening. Imagine that. You are 14. You've barely spoken to your new husband. You've just sat through a 6-hour feast, surrounded by strangers. Your gown is heavy, your hair aching from pins, your stomach tight with nerves. And now you are led to a bed, alone with a man who may be as scared as you, or not at all. And outside the door, silence, listening. That was the reality for many, and yet not all. There were couples who found gentleness, men who asked if it hurt, women who reached out, trembling but curious. There are letters, rare but real, where a husband tells his bride, "We will wait if you wish," where a wife writes, "I did not know joy could be so quiet." Because the wedding night was often not about lust. It was about the unknown. Many young people entered marriage with no education on sex, no guidance, no conversation. They knew only that something would happen, something secret, something painful, something permanent. Girls were warned to endure. Boys were told to prove themselves, and the result was often confusion, clumsiness, even fear. There were also superstitions. In some villages, couples were told not to consummate their marriage until after a special blessing, lest their children be cursed. In others, they were encouraged to lie together immediately to ensure fertility. Some slept with charms beneath the bed. Others drank herbal concoctions said to open the womb or calm the fire. And always, always, there was the shadow of the church. Even on the wedding night, certain acts were forbidden. too much noise, too much enthusiasm, too much attention to the woman's pleasure. These were signs of sin, signs of carnality. Sex was for procreation, not passion, and yet passion still flickered. A hesitant hand, a shared breath, a moment when both lay awake, not speaking but not turning away. Of course, not every story was kind. There were marriages built on coercion, on pressure, on fear. Girls too young, men too angry. Nights that left bruises instead of memories. These stories existed, and they mattered. But they were not the whole story. Because even in a world ruled by silence and shame, some found comfort. Two peasants warming each other beneath a thatched roof. A baker and his wife, laughing after fumbling through their first time. A merchant's daughter who taught her husband how to be gentle. A noble woman who whispered her fears, and a man who listened. These are not the stories written in chronicles, but they are the stories that lived. And in those beds, creaking, cold, unfamiliar, something happened. Not always pleasure, not always love, but a beginning, a step into a new life, a new rhythm, a new way of being. Pleasure was not a word spoken loudly in the Middle Ages, at least not in the context of sex. In public, it was masked, behind duty, behind ritual, behind silence, but in private, in shadow, in whispered moments between breaths, pleasure lived, not boldly, not always safely, but undeniably. And that is where we go tonight. To speak of pleasure, we must first speak of who was allowed to feel it. And the answer in medieval Europe was simple: men. A husband was expected to enjoy sex, within limits, of course. Too much pleasure, too often, could be a sign of weakness or sin. But some pleasure was accepted, even expected. A man's desire proved his virility. His ability to perform was tied to his honor, his reputation, his control over his household. If he failed in bed, it could even be grounds for annulment. For women, it was different. The female body, in theology, in medicine, in culture, was a site of contradiction. It was sacred and dangerous, holy and tempting, soft and sinful. Some believed that women were colder, more passive, less lustful. Others believed the opposite, that women burned with insatiable fire, that their pleasure was a threat. One medieval medical theory claimed that a woman needed to orgasm in order to conceive. Another claimed the opposite, that her pleasure could lead to demonic possession. Some priests warned that a moaning woman was a tool of the devil. Others quietly admitted that mutual enjoyment made stronger marriages. But no one could say for certain, because no one asked the women. Their voices are almost entirely absent from the official record. There are no medieval sex manuals written by women, no diaries preserved in abbey vaults. What we know comes from men, from confessions, from court documents, from physicians who speculated more than they observed. Still, the signs remain. A poem written in the 14th century speaks of a woman whose husband finds her pleasureless until she teaches him how to move more slowly. Another, in a bawdy French tale, tells of a wife who trades kisses for secrets and then refuses to give them back. In folk songs, women boast of what they like, of what they won't accept, of what they secretly seek in the dark. Pleasure was not absent. It was just hidden. Consider the way people touched. Hands again. Always the hands. A gentle stroke on the back of the neck. Fingers tangled in hair. A palm resting on a hip beneath the linen. In a world where bodies were rarely bare, touch carried power. A single caress could speak more than 1,000 words. And when lovers knew each other well, when time and trust allowed, those touches became maps. Slow, careful maps of pleasure. But trust was not always present. In many marriages, sex was routine, mechanical, something to be done, not explored. A woman might never be asked what she liked. She might not know herself. Her experience might begin and end with pain or indifference. And yet, there were exceptions. There were men who listened, who learned. There were women who guided, who asked, who experimented. There were moments that lingered, when pleasure blossomed, even without language. And then there were the others, the ones outside marriage, the ones who didn't wait for permission. Prostitutes, or more accurately, sex workers, played a complicated role in medieval life. In most towns, their presence was both condemned and tolerated. Church officials preached against them. Civic leaders regulated them. Brothels were taxed. Their customers were fined, but they never disappeared. Why? Because desire never disappeared. Some cities even created designated red light districts. In Paris, it was the Rue Gravois. In London, Southwark, these areas were both practical and symbolic, containing what could not be erased. Women in these districts sometimes wore special garments. They were both marked and invisible, necessary and shamed. But they knew pleasure. Not always for themselves, not always honestly, but they knew what people wanted. They listened to secrets no one else heard. They saw the side of men that even wives rarely saw, the hungry, the frightened, the gentle, the cruel. Some became confidants, some became legends, some disappeared, and beyond even them there were the forbidden pleasures, same-sex desire, masturbation, role play, fetish. All these existed, we know they did, because they appear in court records, in confession manuals, in anonymous pamphlets burned and rewritten. A man caught with another man. A woman accused of using a wooden phallus. A monk punished for drawings in the margins of holy books. These were not common stories, but they were real. Desire took many forms, and even in a world of rules, it refused to be silenced. And let us not forget the spaces. The hayloft, the storeroom, the bathhouse, the woods. Places where hands wandered, where kisses deepened, where breath quickened. These were not bedrooms with clean sheets and locked doors. They were improvised, hidden, often cold. But in that very roughness, in that urgency, something vivid lived. A heartbeat, a gasp, a laugh muffled in a shoulder. This, too, was pleasure. Messy, fleeting, human. And yet it carried risks. Pregnancy, disease, shame, accusation, even violence. For women especially, pleasure came with consequences. A single act could ruin her standing, her future, her safety. And so, many learned to keep quiet, to pretend, to endure. But some didn't. Some took pleasure anyway. Some sought it, shaped it, shared it, quietly, boldly, with trembling fingers or steady eyes. And those moments, those rare, real moments, are still here, waiting in the cracks of the records, waiting in the spaces between sermons, waiting, even now, in the corners of your mind. Not all desire wore a wedding ring. Not all longing walked hand in hand with duty. Some love bloomed in secret. Some pleasure was borrowed, stolen, whispered under breath, hidden in alleyways or behind cloister walls. Tonight, we follow those paths, the ones not marked on the maps drawn by the church. The other side of desire. Let's begin with adultery. It happened, of course, just as it happens now. Men took lovers. Women met in barns or by the river. Sometimes it was about passion, sometimes loneliness, sometimes survival. For a peasant wife with a cold husband and colder winters, a warm touch from another man could feel like rescue. For a merchant far from home, The hands of a stranger could ease the weight of months on the road. Adultery was a sin, one of the gravest. Punishments varied: fines, public shaming, in rare cases even death. But more often it was hidden, gossiped about, covered up by bribery or silence, especially when it involved the powerful. Take, for instance, the case of Lady Marjorie, a noblewoman in 14th century England, married off at 16 to a man twice her age. For years she bore him children, managed his estate, endured his rages. And then came Thomas, her husband's squire. Younger, gentle. He brought her books. He listened. One spring they were caught. He was exiled. She was sent to a convent. And yet her letters survived. She wrote of the smell of his cloak, the curve of his smile, the way he never took her for granted. I was not young when I loved him, she wrote, but I felt as though I was. Then there were those who paid for affection. Prostitution in medieval Europe was not hidden. It was regulated. Towns set up licensed brothels, often near city gates or markets. The logic was simple. Desire was inevitable. Better to contain it than deny it. The church disapproved publicly, but privately accepted it as a lesser evil. In these brothels, women worked under strict rules. Some were there by choice, others by coercion. Some had protectors, some were entirely alone. They wore bells sometimes or colored veils. They were not allowed to walk near churches. But clients came anyway, knights, merchants, even clergy. And in those candlelit rooms, pleasure was exchanged not for love, but for coin. Yet sometimes, rarely, something real emerged. There's a record from Avignon of a prostitute named Isabel who refused to take money from one particular man. "He brings me flowers," she told a magistrate. "Not to buy me, just to see me smile." They met for over a year. When he died in a street fight, she lit a candle for him every night until she left the city. Then there were the ones who didn't fit at all, the ones whose desires had no name, or too many names, men who loved men, women who kissed in gardens, people who lived in bodies that didn't match what the world expected. The church called them sodomites, heretics, inverts. The punishments were brutal: exile, imprisonment, even execution. But still, the love endured. In 1321, 2 women in Paris were arrested for living as man and wife. They had shared a home for years. The court records are cold, but the neighbors' testimonies are not. One neighbor said, "They held hands as they walked. They laughed at each other's jokes. I thought they were sisters. I think now they were more." In Florence, a group of men formed a secret circle. They shared poetry. They met in gardens. Some were caught, tortured, forced to confess, but others escaped. And their letters, hidden in monasteries and private libraries, speak of longing so tender it almost hurts to read. "I will not go to heaven," one wrote, "unless I can take your voice with me." Even in monasteries, desire slipped through. Young monks shared beds in crowded dormitories. Older ones wrote sermons about resisting temptation, and sometimes failed. In one famous scandal, a Benedictine abbot was found with love letters tucked into his psalter. He was sent to a distant abbey, forbidden to speak. The letters were burned, but not before someone copied them. Desire, even when denied, refused to disappear. And there were others still. People who didn't desire at all, or who desired only freedom from touch, from roles, from expectation. A widow who never remarried, choosing books over bed sheets. A farmhand who lived alone, content among goats and stars. They, too, were part of the story. Because the Middle Ages were not a monolith. They were filled with contradiction, with quiet rebellion, with aching truths. The official voices spoke of sin, but the human ones whispered of need, of connection, of hands reached out in the dark, and in that darkness there was courage. To want what could not be spoken, to love what could not be named, to hold someone anyway. And when it was done, when the bodies had quieted, when the hands released, when the breath steadied, what came after? In the Middle Ages, intimacy didn't end with pleasure. It unfolded into consequence, into flesh and blood, into new lives, and sometimes into endings too soon. Tonight, we walk through that aftermath. Quietly, gently. For many, sex led to pregnancy, and pregnancy, in the medieval world, was no small matter. It was not expected to be easy. It was not assumed to be safe. A woman knew, with every missed moon, that she was stepping toward something that might change her, or end her. There were no prenatal vitamins, no ultrasounds, no sterile rooms, just herbs and hope, just midwives and prayer. Some women had 10 children, 12, 15. Some watched them die in infancy, one after another. Some died themselves, of fever, of blood loss, of infections we now treat with a pill. To be a mother was to stand at the edge of a cliff again and again. And yet they kept stepping forward. They passed down knowledge, woman to woman, whisper to whisper. How to ease nausea with mint. How to soften the cervix with oil. How to recognize a breach by touch alone. Midwives became keepers of sacred knowledge, trusted, feared, sometimes accused of witchcraft, but always needed. And when the child came, pain, hours, screams, silence, sometimes joy, sometimes grief. A father might wait outside, pacing, a neighbor might boil water, a priest might bless the room. And in that moment, wet, trembling, new, the child would arrive into a world where life was uncertain from the start. Sex, then, was not just about pleasure or sin. It was about survival, and not just for women. Men, too, carried consequences. A man who fathered a child outside marriage could be forced to pay, to marry, to confess. His name might be written in court records, scrawled beside the word bastard. His reputation, especially if he was noble or clergy, could suffer irreparably. And yet not all did the right thing. Some disappeared, some denied. Some sent money quietly through a servant, and some, rare but real, embraced the child, raised it, loved it, even if it bore no name. But beyond pregnancy, there were other consequences. Disease, syphilis would come later, with the age of exploration, but other infections were already known. Fire of Venus, they called one. Ulcers, swelling, fevers. Treatments were crude. Mercury, cauterization, prayers. There were no cures, only endurance and shame. Even without disease, there was social cost. A girl who lost her virginity before marriage might never find a husband. A boy caught in the wrong bed could lose his apprenticeship. A widow who remarried too soon could be shunned. A monk who confessed too much could be sent away. The body remembered, even when the lips kept silent. And then there was death. Not always, not often. But sometimes sex and death were close neighbors. Women died in childbirth. Men died in duels fought over jealousy. Lovers were executed for adultery, or hanged for breaking oaths. A moment of pleasure could ripple outward, into lives broken, homes shattered, names blackened. And yet, people still sought each other, still reached for warmth in cold beds, still whispered vows in barns and by hearths, still kissed, despite the risks, because the other side of consequence was connection. In the quiet after, many found peace. A husband holding his wife as she cried from pain she hadn't expected. A woman brushing sweat from her lover's brow, watching the fire burn low. Two people lying side by side, listening to the rain against the shutters, neither speaking, both awake. There was intimacy in those silences, there was grace, and as the centuries passed, as beliefs shifted, as science grew, the stories changed, but the core remained. People want to be close, not just physically, not just in motion, but truly close, to be seen, to be held, to be known. Even now, with all our knowledge, our freedom, our light, we still chase what they did. The same breath, the same heartbeat, the same moment when everything else fades, and only presence remains. So, what was sex really like in medieval times? It was awkward, it was quiet, it was sacred, feared, hidden, shared. It was painful and joyful and confusing and rare. It was human, and that's what matters most. Not the rules, not the rituals, not the records, but the people. The girl who waited by a window, the boy who wrote her name in the dirt, the wife who forgave, the husband who learned, the lovers who ran, the ones who stayed. They were like us. And now, as the candle dims, as the night folds around you, may you rest in that knowing. You are part of their story.